My first exposure to classical music, believe it or not, was probably Ilayaraja's music. It was Ilayaraja's music that uh, got me hooked on to Bach and Beethoven and Mozart and composers like that. And it was so obvious. All those influences were so obvious in Ilayaraja's music. I actually started actively listening to a lot of classical music much later. I guess it was a spin off from uh, jazz, especially when I started listening to Duke Ellington and Charles Mingus and composers like that. I just loved how they orchestrated, and so that logically took me towards classical music. I remember a concert in 1996 in Mumbai called Common Chords, um, for which I thought, wow, it would be cool to actually write a fugue, but a fugue in a Carnatic raga. And I already heard Ilayaraja do stuff like that in his record How to Name It. And I started doing compositions like that, and so I got so seriously into Bach, and it just hit me like that. And then, of course, Beethoven. I had a cassette of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony even when I was in high school or something. And I really, really loved that work. So yes, just being open to classical music was just an amazing thing, a big transformation in my life. And later, when I went to Berkeley, I was exposed to the music of Debussy, Ravel, Stravinsky, and people like that, and which was just mind blowing for me. And I remember when I first met my wife Shalini, it was amazing. In Chennai, we would sit and listen to Ravel and Debussy and Shostakovich and all that. Um, as a composer, as someone who always wanted to push myself as a composer, it was just so obvious that I get into classical music. And once I developed a deep love for it, I spent the later part of my Berkeley years doing classical composition. And one of my most influential teachers, probably like one of my most favorite teachers was John Bavicki, and he really encouraged me to just go for it. So that was a landmark time for me, analyzing Beethoven string quartets, Bartok string quartets, and sitting with scores every day. Probably the biggest music that's there in my CD collection today is classical music, and it's informed every aspect of my work, especially Ravel, Shostakovich, Benjamin Britten, Stravinsky, Bach, Beethoven. These guys are for real, and I'm so happy that I have classical music in my world.